In the early morning hours of January 29, 1991, as darkness blanketed the Saudi Arabian desert and a new moon ensured complete blackness across the Kuwaiti border, Iraqi commanders launched a surprise attack on the coastal town of Khafji, believing that night movement would conceal their armored columns from coalition surveillance, and that the offensive would catch American and Saudi forces unprepared. Three mechanized brigades, supported by artillery and air defense systems, crossed the border and drove south toward what Iraqi military planners believed would be a strategic victory, a demonstration that coalition forces could be defeated through aggressive maneuver, and that the much-vaunted American technological superiority was an illusion that disappeared once the sun went down. What those Iraqi commanders did not know, what their intelligence officers had failed to detect or comprehend, was that orbiting 38,000 feet above the battlefield, invisible in the darkness and beyond the reach of Iraqi air defenses, an experimental Boeing E-8A aircraft equipped with synthetic aperture radar and moving target indicator systems was tracking every vehicle in their assault force in real time, counting the tanks, measuring their speed, recording their direction of travel, and transmitting that information via encrypted data links to coalition command centers, where American and Saudi commanders watched the Iraqi attack develop, with a clarity that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. Within minutes of detecting the Iraqi movement, the E-8A crew, a mix of Air Force pilots and sensor operators working alongside Army intelligence specialists who had been trained on the system only weeks before its deployment, began vectoring coalition strike aircraft toward the Iraqi columns, guiding A-10 Thunderbolts and F-16 Fighting Falcons armed with cluster bombs and precision-guided munitions onto targets that the Iraqi crews believed were hidden by darkness and distance. By dawn, 70% of the Iraqi vehicles committed to the Khafji offensive had been destroyed, the survivors scattered and retreating in disarray, and coalition ground commanders, initially concerned that the attack signaled the beginning of a major Iraqi offensive that would force them to abandon the planned timeline for the ground invasion, received confirmation from the E-8A crew that no reinforcements were moving south, that the Iraqi attack was an isolated thrust unsupported by follow-on forces, and that the threat could be contained without disrupting the broader campaign plan. The Battle of Khafji, remembered primarily as the first significant ground engagement of Operation Desert Storm, was in fact the debut of a weapons system that transformed ground warfare by making the battlefield transparent to American commanders, while leaving adversaries blind to how completely they had been compromised. The Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System emerged from parallel programs initiated by the United States Army and the United States Air Force during the late 1970s. Programs born from the recognition that NATO forces defending Western Europe against a potential Warsaw Pact invasion would face a fundamental intelligence challenge. Soviet doctrine envisioned massive armored thrusts spearheaded by tank divisions supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled artillery, formations that would attempt to achieve breakthrough by concentrating overwhelming combat power at selected points along the NATO front line, and then exploiting those breakthroughs by pouring follow-on echelons through the gaps faster than NATO commanders could respond. Detecting and targeting those second-echelon forces, divisions held in reserve dozens or hundreds of kilometers behind the front line, was recognized as critical to NATO's defensive strategy, for if those formations could be identified and destroyed before they reached the battlefield, the initial Soviet assault would lose momentum and NATO forces would gain time to reposition and counterattack. The problem was that existing intelligence collection systems were inadequate for the task. Satellites provided strategic warning and could photograph large areas but required hours or days to process imagery and could not provide real-time updates on enemy movements. Tactical reconnaissance aircraft could photograph specific targets but had limited range, could only operate in daylight or clear weather, and were vulnerable to air defenses. Ground-based radar systems had sufficient range but were constrained by terrain and could not see beyond the curvature of the Earth, making them useless for detecting forces operating deep in enemy territory. What was needed was an airborne radar system capable of detecting and tracking ground vehicles at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers, operating continuously for hours regardless of weather or lighting conditions, and transmitting targeting data directly to strike aircraft and ground commanders in time to influence tactical decisions. The Army's program, initially designated Standoff Target Acquisition System and later renamed Tactical Surveillance and Target Acquisition Radar, focused on developing a system that could be mounted on fixed-wing aircraft and provide intelligence to corps and division commanders planning deep strikes against enemy formations. The Air Force program, designated Pave Mover, pursued similar capabilities, but emphasized integration with airborne command and control systems, and support for interdiction missions flown by fighter bombers tasked with destroying enemy forces before they reach the battlefield. Both programs faced significant technical challenges, particularly in developing radar systems capable of distinguishing individual vehicles from ground clutter, processing vast amounts of data in real time, and transmitting that information over secure data links to multiple users simultaneously. In 1982, recognizing that the two programs were duplicating effort and competing for scarce funding, Congress directed the Department of Defense to merge the Army and Air Force initiatives into a single joint program, a decision that reflected growing congressional impatience with inter-service rivalry and a belief that joint operations would characterize future conflicts. The newly consolidated program, designated Joint Surveillance and Target Attack Radar System, received funding authorization in 1985, and the prime contract was awarded to Grumman Aerospace Corporation with the requirement to deliver 2 prototype aircraft capable of demonstrating operational capability by 1988. Grumman's solution was to modify surplus Boeing 700-7300 series commercial airliners, aircraft that had been retired from passenger service, but retained airframes with sufficient structural life to support conversion into specialized military platforms. The most distinctive modification was the installation of a 40-foot canoe-shaped radome mounted beneath the forward fuselage, a structure that housed the 24-foot AN/APY-7 side-looking phased array radar antenna, a system capable of electronically steering its beam across a 120-degree arc without physically moving the antenna, allowing the aircraft to scan vast areas of terrain while flying in a straight-line orbit pattern. The radar operated in 2 primary modes: moving target indicator, which detected vehicles, tanks, and trucks based on Doppler frequency shifts caused by their motion relative to the aircraft, and synthetic aperture radar, which created high-resolution images of stationary targets such as buildings, bridges, radar installations, and parked vehicles. The moving target indicator mode allowed operators to track hundreds of vehicles simultaneously, displaying their positions, speeds, and directions of travel on console screens that updated every few seconds, creating a dynamic picture of the battlefield that resembled a real-time video game, except that every blip represented an actual vehicle whose destruction could be coordinated by simply passing its coordinates to a strike aircraft loitering nearby. The synthetic aperture radar mode produced images with resolutions fine enough to distinguish between different types of vehicles, identify the configuration of defensive positions, and detect changes in terrain that might indicate recent construction or camouflage efforts, capabilities that proved invaluable for battle damage assessment and intelligence preparation of the battlefield. Inside the aircraft, the mission crew operated from a windowless compartment lined with 18 operator workstations, each equipped with multiple displays, keyboards, and communication systems that allowed operators to manipulate radar data, designate targets, and coordinate with external users. The crew composition reflected the joint nature of the program. Air Force personnel served as pilots, navigators, flight engineers, and several of the radar operators, while Army personnel manned positions focused on intelligence analysis and ground targeting coordination. This arrangement, unprecedented in American military aviation where aircraft were typically operated exclusively by a single service, created initial friction as Air Force and Army operators learned to work together, their different training backgrounds and doctrinal perspectives sometimes leading to disagreements about how the system should be employed and which targets deserved priority. Air Force operators, trained to support air interdiction missions, focused on identifying time-sensitive targets that could be attacked immediately by fighter bombers, emphasizing speed and responsiveness over detailed analysis. Army operators, trained in intelligence preparation of the battlefield and focused on supporting ground maneuver commanders, emphasized pattern analysis and predictive assessments that required correlating current radar data with historical observations to discern enemy intentions and operational plans. The tension between these perspectives, rather than undermining effectiveness, ultimately strengthened the system's versatility by ensuring that JSTARS supported both air and ground operations, providing tactical intelligence to strike aircraft while simultaneously delivering operational intelligence to corps and division commanders planning future operations. When Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, the two E-8A prototype aircraft were still in developmental testing at Grumman's facility in Melbourne, Florida, their systems undergoing evaluation by test crews who were identifying software bugs, refining operator procedures, and validating radar performance against baseline requirements. Neither aircraft had been declared operationally ready, and significant technical issues remained unresolved. But as coalition forces deployed to Saudi Arabia throughout the autumn of 1990 and military planners began developing offensive options to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait, requests began arriving at the Pentagon from commanders in theater who had heard about the JSTARS program and believed its capabilities could provide a decisive advantage. The Iraqi Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's most elite and best-equipped formations, consisted of 8 heavy divisions equipped with T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and self-propelled artillery, forces that vastly outnumbered the coalition ground forces available in the early months of Desert Shield and posed a credible threat to Saudi Arabia if Saddam decided to continue his offensive southward. Coalition intelligence officers needed to know where those divisions were positioned, how they were deployed, whether they were digging in for defensive operations or preparing for offensive action, and most critically, whether any movement toward the Saudi border signaled an impending attack. Satellite imagery provided periodic snapshots but could not offer continuous surveillance. Tactical reconnaissance aircraft lacked the range and endurance to maintain persistent coverage, and human intelligence sources inside Iraq were scarce and unreliable. JSTARS offered the possibility of continuous, all-weather surveillance across the entire Kuwaiti theater of operations, but deploying developmental aircraft with incomplete systems and partially trained crews into a combat zone represented a significant risk, one that generated intense debate within the Air Force and the Office of the Secretary of Defense about whether operational necessity justified accepting the possibility of catastrophic failure or loss of classified technology. The decision to deploy was made in late December 1990, driven by the recognition that the air campaign scheduled to begin in mid-January would create a fluid battlefield environment where real-time intelligence on Iraqi ground movements would be essential for maximizing the effectiveness of airstrikes and protecting coalition ground forces from Iraqi counterattacks. On January 12, 1991, the two E-8A aircraft, accompanied by 6 ground station modules mounted on 5-ton trucks and crewed by Army intelligence specialists trained by Colonel Martin Kleiner, who had formed JSTARS Operational Detachment, one specifically for the deployment, arrived at Riyadh Air Base in Saudi Arabia after a 17-hour transatlantic flight during which air crews and mission specialists conducted final training exercises and reviewed operational procedures. 2 days later, on January 14, the first operational JSTARS mission launched, initially planned as an engineering test flight to verify that the aircraft systems functioned properly in the Middle Eastern electromagnetic environment, and that data links to the ground station modules operated without interference from the dense concentration of coalition radars, radios, and jamming systems saturating the radio spectrum. What began as a test flight transformed within hours into an 8-tower combat mission as operators detected Iraqi troop movements along the Kuwait-Saudi border, identified vehicle convoys moving through southern Iraq, and provided targeting data to coalition strike aircraft that destroyed dozens of Iraqi trucks and armored vehicles attempting to reinforce forward positions. The mission demonstrated that JSTARS could perform as advertised under operational conditions, and from that moment forward, one of the two E-8A aircraft flew every night throughout Desert Storm, accumulating 49 consecutive missions, more than 500 combat hours, and a mission effectiveness rate that exceeded 98% despite the developmental status of the systems, and the compressed training timeline that had left crews still learning how to optimize radar modes and coordinate data dissemination. If you value learning how American technology turned traditional military concepts like concealment and surprise into obsolete relics of pre-digital warfare, subscribe to Classified Warfare for future episodes that reveal the systems and operations that gave the United States an invisible edge on battlefields from Kuwait to Kosovo. The ability of JSTARS to detect and track mobile Scud missile launchers, Iraq's primary strategic weapon, and a system whose attacks on Israel and Saudi Arabia threatened to fracture the coalition by provoking Israeli retaliation, became one of the system's most significant contributions to Desert Storm, despite the fact that Scud hunting had never been part of the original mission profile. Iraqi Scud launchers, mounted on modified Soviet MAZ-543 transporter-erector vehicles, were designed for mobility and rapid deployment, capable of launching from unprepared positions and relocating before counter-battery fire or airstrikes could target them. Iraqi crews operated primarily at night, driving from concealed hide sites to pre-surveyed launch positions, erecting the missile, conducting the launch sequence, and departing within 30 minutes, a timeline calculated to minimize exposure to coalition surveillance. American intelligence initially struggled to locate Scud launchers, as satellite coverage was intermittent and tactical reconnaissance aircraft lacked the ability to search vast areas of desert where launchers could be hidden among commercial trucks or camouflaged under desert netting. JSTARS crews, analyzing the patterns of vehicle movement detected by the Moving Target Indicator radar, began to recognize signatures associated with Scud operations. Convoys of support vehicles moving in formation toward specific areas, clusters of vehicles stationary for extended periods in locations consistent with launch sites, and high-speed departures following launch events that had been detected by infrared satellites. By correlating JSTARS radar tracks with launch detection data from satellites, and with reports from special operations teams operating deep inside Iraq, intelligence analysts developed pattern-of-life assessments that identified likely Scud operating areas and predicted when and where launches were most probable. Strike aircraft armed with cluster bombs and guided munitions were directed to patrol those areas, guided by real-time updates from JSTARS operators who tracked vehicles as they moved and provided coordinates accurate enough to allow pilots to visually acquire targets using night vision goggles or infrared targeting pods. The impact on Iraqi Scud operations was devastating. Launchers that had operated with relative impunity during the first week of the war found themselves under constant surveillance, their movements detected within minutes, their hide sites compromised, their launch cycles disrupted by airstrikes that destroyed support vehicles, killed crews, and forced constant relocation that degraded operational effectiveness. By the end of Desert Storm, coalition airstrikes had destroyed or damaged dozens of Scud launchers, a success rate that would have been impossible without JSTARS, providing the persistent surveillance and targeting data that turned the vast Iraqi desert from a sanctuary into a kill zone. The tracking of the Iraqi Republican Guard during the ground offensive that began on February 24, 1991, demonstrated JSTARS' capability to support maneuver warfare at operational scale, providing corps commanders with a comprehensive picture of enemy movements that allowed them to anticipate Iraqi reactions and adjust coalition operations accordingly. The Republican Guard, deployed in defensive positions across southern Iraq and northern Kuwait, constituted the Iraqi center of gravity, the force that coalition planners believed must be destroyed to ensure that Saddam Hussein could not reconstitute a credible military threat after the war. General Norman Schwarzkopf's campaign plan, a massive left hook that sent armored and mechanized divisions racing across the desert to outflank Iraqi defenses and cut off retreat routes into Iraq, depended on maintaining surprise and preventing the Republican Guard from repositioning to counter the coalition advance. JSTARS aircraft, orbiting continuously throughout the 4 days of ground combat, tracked the Republican Guard divisions as they began to recognize the scale of the coalition maneuver and attempted to reposition northward to escape encirclement. The radar returns showed hundreds of vehicles moving in columns along highways and secondary roads, their formations disintegrating as coalition airstrikes and artillery fire destroyed bridges, cratered roads, and turned orderly withdrawals into chaotic routes where individual tanks and trucks scattered across the desert in desperate attempts to reach safety. JSTARS operators provided continuous updates to coalition commanders, confirming that the Republican Guard was retreating rather than counterattacking, allowing ground forces to press their advance without diverting resources to defend against threats that no longer existed. The Hammurabi, Medina, and Tawakalna divisions, once considered Iraq's most elite forces, suffered catastrophic losses as they attempted to withdraw under constant observation by JSTARS and under continuous attack by coalition aircraft and ground forces that knew exactly where they were and where they were going. Brigadier General John Stewart, the G2 intelligence officer for Army Central Command during Desert Storm, provided what became the definitive assessment of JSTARS impact when he stated that the system was the single most valuable intelligence and targeting collection system in the entire war, and that JSTARS was instrumental in making every key decision during the ground campaign. That assessment, coming from the senior Army intelligence officer responsible for supporting the largest American ground offensive since World War II, reflected the reality that JSTARS had transformed intelligence collection from a process of assembling fragmented reports into a comprehensive picture, into a capability that provided commanders with near-perfect situational awareness of enemy dispositions and movements. Air Force Chief of Staff General Merrill McPeak, evaluating JSTARS from the perspective of air power employment, predicted that American forces would never again want to fight without a JSTARS-type system, a prediction that proved accurate as every major American military operation conducted over the following 3 decades included JSTARS aircraft providing battlefield surveillance. The contrast between American commanders who could see the entire battlefield in real time and Iraqi commanders who operated blind to coalition movements, who discovered too late that their forces had been tracked continuously, who realized that every attempt at maneuver or repositioning was detected and countered before it could achieve any tactical advantage, encapsulated the information dominance that characterized Desert Storm and defined American military superiority in the post-Cold War era. The operational tempo sustained by JSTARS crews during Desert Storm placed extraordinary demands on personnel who flew missions lasting 10 to 12 hours, monitored radar displays continuously throughout those missions, coordinated with dozens of external users simultaneously, and performed complex analysis under time pressure while operating equipment that was still developmental and prone to occasional malfunctions that required creative troubleshooting to restore functionality. The mission crews worked in a cramped, windowless compartment where the only indication of day or night came from the changing patterns of vehicle movement detected by the radar, where sleep deprivation was managed through sheer willpower and copious quantities of coffee, and where the knowledge that coalition pilots and ground troops depended on the intelligence they provided created a sense of responsibility that overrode exhaustion and discomfort. Pilots flew racetrack orbits at altitudes above 35,000 feet, high enough to remain beyond the reach of Iraqi air defenses but low enough to maximize radar performance, their flight paths carefully coordinated with the broader air tasking order to ensure JSTARS aircraft remained clear of strike packages, air refueling tracks, and surface-to-air missile engagement zones. The mission commander, typically a senior Air Force officer with extensive electronic warfare or reconnaissance experience, coordinated the overall collection effort, prioritizing targets based on requests from ground commanders and strike coordinators, directing radar operators to shift focus between moving target indicator and synthetic aperture radar modes as tactical situations evolved, and managing the flow of information to multiple users whose requirements sometimes conflicted and whose priorities changed as the battlefield situation developed. The interface between Air Force and Army operators, initially a source of friction during the compressed pre-deployment training period, evolved into seamless collaboration as crews learned to leverage each service's strengths and compensate for each other's limitations, creating a truly joint operational capability that validated the congressional mandate for service integration. The transition from experimental prototype to operational weapon system occurred with remarkable speed following Desert Storm, driven by the overwhelming evidence of JSTARS effectiveness and by congressional enthusiasm for a system that had demonstrably contributed to the war's lopsided outcome. Funding that had been constrained during development was dramatically increased, and the Air Force received authorization to procure 17 production E-8C aircraft, conversions of surplus Boeing 707 airliners that would be equipped with upgraded versions of the AN/APY-7 radar and mission systems refined based on lessons learned during Desert Storm. The 93rd Air Control Wing, activated in January 1996 at Robins Air Force Base in Georgia, accepted its first production E-8C in June 1996 and achieved initial operational capability in December 1997, less than 7 years after the system's combat debut, and a timeline that contrasted sharply with the decades-long development cycles that characterized most major defense acquisition programs. The rapid fielding reflected recognition that JSTARS addressed a capability gap that had existed throughout the Cold War but had only become apparent during Desert Storm, when the absence of persistent ground surveillance during peacetime operations in Europe meant that NATO commanders lacked the real-time intelligence they would have needed to counter a Warsaw Pact offensive. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War did not diminish JSTARS relevance. Instead, it expanded the system's mission set into contingency operations, peacekeeping, and counterinsurgency, where the ability to monitor ground movements across vast areas proved equally valuable for enforcing ceasefires, tracking arms shipments, and detecting insurgent activity. The deployment of JSTARS aircraft to Operation Joint Endeavour in Bosnia during December 1995, where the system monitored compliance with the Dayton Peace Accords by tracking military movements across the former Yugoslavia, demonstrated the versatility of a system originally designed to detect Soviet tank columns, but equally capable of supporting peacekeeping operations in complex terrain where mountainous topography and urban clutter created challenging radar environments. JSTARS crews flew 95 consecutive missions, accumulating more than 1,000 flight hours with a mission effectiveness rate exceeding 98%, and provided NATO commanders with intelligence that confirmed compliance with arms limitations, detected unauthorized troop movements, and supported war crimes investigations by documenting the movement of vehicles associated with massacre sites. The mountainous terrain of Bosnia, dramatically different from the flat deserts of Kuwait, required operators to develop new techniques for interpreting radar returns degraded by terrain masking, and to distinguish legitimate civilian traffic from military vehicles attempting to evade observation by blending into commercial traffic patterns. The lessons learned during Joint Endeavour informed subsequent JSTARS operations during the Kosovo conflict in 1999, where the system tracked Serbian forces withdrawing from Kosovo and supported NATO airstrikes against Serbian military targets, and during sustained operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, where JSTARS aircraft flew more than 63,000 hours and 5,200 combat missions between 2001 and 2011. Providing battlefield surveillance that supported counterinsurgency operations fundamentally different from the conventional warfare scenarios that had driven the system's original development. The application of JSTARS to counterinsurgency presented technical and operational challenges that tested the system's adaptability. Insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan operated in small groups, often traveling in civilian vehicles indistinguishable from legitimate traffic, using urban environments where radar returns were cluttered by buildings and civilian activity, and employing tactics designed to avoid patterns that might trigger detection by pattern analysis algorithms. JSTARS operators developed new techniques for identifying insurgent activity, focusing on anomalies such as vehicles departing paved roads and driving cross-country toward locations associated with weapons caches or improvised explosive device emplacement sites, convoys of vehicles moving in formation during curfew hours when civilian traffic was prohibited, and repeated patterns of movement that suggested reconnaissance of coalition facilities or supply routes. The integration of JSTARS with other intelligence sources, including signals intelligence from communications intercepts, human intelligence from informants and captured insurgents, and full-motion video from unmanned aerial vehicles that could provide visual confirmation of JSTARS radar contacts, created a multi-layered intelligence architecture that compensated for the limitations of each individual system, and provided commanders with a comprehensive understanding of insurgent networks and operations. The success of this approach was reflected in the targeting of hundreds of high-value individuals whose communications were intercepted, whose movements were tracked by JSTARS, and whose locations were confirmed by drone surveillance before special operations forces launched raids that resulted in their capture or death. The strategic lesson embodied by JSTARS was that transparency on the modern battlefield was achievable through the integration of advanced sensors, persistent surveillance, and real-time data dissemination, and that adversaries who relied on traditional operational security measures such as night movement, dispersion, and camouflage discovered those measures were ineffective against a system capable of seeing through darkness, weather, and deception to track every vehicle simultaneously across hundreds of square miles. Iraqi commanders who moved tank columns at night believing darkness provided concealment, who dispersed artillery under camouflage nets assuming visual reconnaissance could not detect them, who hid Scud launchers in the desert confident that their mobility rendered them undetectable, learned too late that every vehicle they operated, every movement they made, every repositioning they attempted was observed in real time by American operators who passed targeting data to strike aircraft and ground commanders before Iraqi forces realized they had been compromised. The billions of dollars invested by Iraq and other adversaries in camouflage, deception, and electronic warfare measures designed to deny enemy intelligence proved insufficient to counter a system that operated beyond the range of their air defenses, that could not be jammed or spoofed by electronic countermeasures available to regional military powers, and that provided targeting data with accuracy and timeliness that made the distinction between detection and destruction a matter of minutes rather than hours. The retirement of the E-8C JSTARS fleet between 2022 and 2023, a decision driven by budgetary constraints and a strategic pivot toward distributed sensor architectures rather than reliance on large, crude aircraft, marked the end of an era but did not diminish the historical significance of a system that had transformed ground warfare by making the battlefield transparent. The JSTARS performed its final operational mission on September 21, 2023, and conducted its last flight on November 15, 2023, concluding 32 years of operational service during which the fleet flew 14,000 operational sorties and accumulated more than 141,000 flight hours, participating in every major American military operation from Desert Storm through the final withdrawal from Afghanistan. The decision to replace JSTARS with a network of space-based sensors, unmanned aerial vehicles, and ground-based radars reflected the Air Force's assessment that the future battlefield would be characterized by peer competitors possessing advanced air defenses capable of threatening large, non-stealthy aircraft operating at high altitude, and that distributed sensors networked through advanced battle management systems would provide greater resilience and survivability than a small fleet of crude aircraft vulnerable to modern surface-to-air missiles. Yet the legacy of JSTARS extended beyond its technological capabilities into the operational concepts it validated, the joint service cooperation it demonstrated, and the proof it provided that information dominance could be as decisive as firepower superiority. The men and women who served aboard JSTARS aircraft, flying missions that lasted 12 hours or more in cramped conditions with minimal amenities, staring at radar displays for hours while tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously, coordinating with ground commanders and strike aircraft while managing competing priorities and conflicting requirements, rarely received public recognition for contributions that directly influenced the outcome of battles, and saved the lives of coalition troops who fought with the confidence that American intelligence knew where the enemy was and where he was going. They operated a system that was still developmental during its combat debut, that required constant troubleshooting and creative problem-solving to maintain functionality, that demanded expertise in radar theory, signal processing, tactics, and military intelligence that took years to acquire and could not be replicated through automation. They formed a community that took pride in their unique mission, in their status as the Air Force's only joint crew aircraft where Army and Air Force personnel worked side by side as equals, and in their reputation as the eyes that saw everything and the voice that guided strike aircraft onto targets that enemy commanders believed were invisible. The transformation of ground warfare accomplished by JSTARS, the shift from an environment where concealment was achievable and operational security could protect forces from enemy detection to one where transparency was the default condition, and every vehicle movement was observable in real time, represented a paradigm change as significant as the introduction of aerial reconnaissance in World War I or the deployment of satellite imagery during the Cold War. Iraqi commanders during Desert Storm, Serbian commanders during Kosovo, and insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan all discovered that the traditional tools of operational security were useless against an adversary possessing persistent surveillance capabilities that rendered darkness irrelevant, whether immaterial and camouflage ineffective. The confidence that military forces had placed for centuries in the ability to conceal movements, to surprise the enemy through unexpected maneuvers, to achieve tactical advantage through deception and stealth, evaporated when confronted with a system that could track every vehicle across an entire theater of operations simultaneously and transmit that information to strike aircraft and ground commanders in time to target detected forces before they reached their objectives. JSTARS demonstrated that the fog of war, the uncertainty and confusion that had characterized military operations throughout history, could be penetrated through technology that provided commanders with situational awareness approaching omniscience, and that the side possessing that awareness held an advantage that no amount of courage, tactical skill, or operational art could overcome. Join us at Classified Warfare as we continue to reveal the classified systems and technologies that gave the United States invisible dominance on battlefields from the Cold War through the global war on terror, uncovering the platforms and operations that turned adversary assumptions into fatal vulnerabilities and ensured that American forces always saw farther, struck harder, and knew more than enemies ever imagined possible.